We have many programs in different regions, and we're curious to learn how policy can nurture and scale innovation around the world. What are the policy roadblocks to commercialization? What are the important clean energy tech innovations? How can the ecosystem help scale them? So this panel explores the nexus of policy and energy innovation with three incredible stellar panelists from Vietnam, the Philippines, and California. We're going to start off tonight with Katrina Lenny Koenig, who's the supervisor of the Energy Research and Development at the California Clean Energy Commission. She leads a team that develops technology scale-up initiatives to accelerate a just transition to a clean energy future. She and her team oversee the CEC's design-build competitions to transform underserved neighborhoods into some of the most technologically advanced clean energy communities in the world. And prior to joining the CEC, she conducted laboratory performance testing and evaluation of emerging technologies. Katrina is committed to bringing together diverse stakeholders to address the multifaceted challenges of sustainable development with the ultimate goal of ushering in a regenerative society. So to kick it off, Katrina, take us away.
Thank you for the introduction, Kate. I'm going to share my screen here. All right, you guys can see my screen. So as Kate introduced, I'll be talking about the symbiotic relationship of innovation and policy in California. And to kick us off, I'm just going to open us with the greatest innovator on earth. And so let's go ahead. Slide. All right, so biomimicry is a practice that learns from and mimics the strategies found in nature to solve human design challenges and to find hope along the way. And so we're going to look to an ecosystem here and think about what do we see as something that's thriving. And so to me, the image with the waterfall is has abundance of resources, right? We see the sunlight, we see the water, we see the rich soil, we see the diverse species that are working together with the ultimate goal of creating this thriving ecosystem. And to the right, you'll see that there's the monocrop designed by humans, not the most effective system for resilience and for sustainability. It requires a lot of inputs, and it doesn't give back a lot to the local ecosystem there. So when we think about the diverse challenges that we're faced with around the globe, we really need to think about those diverse solutions that are place-based solutions that really work to bring an integrated approach to each of the communities from which they're emerging. And so we cannot tackle this alone with generalist solutions, and we'll get ourselves in trouble. Now, solar, of course, it'll be a part of it, utility scale solar, but we definitely need a diversity of solutions to emerge. So I like to bring in the example of California's thriving innovation ecosystem. And there are three key elements that I see in our clean tech industry. One of those is the big goals. So the big goals are set forth by our policymakers. Another is the culture of investing in ideas. So California has this culture knowing that innovation and bold ideas kind of emerge from supporting those unique ideas that emerge from diverse solutions. And then we also tap into our resource networks and making sure that we're working together to achieve our goals. So I'll start with the big goals. So California's big policy goals right now, one of the main ones right now we have is SB 100. And SB 100 is leading us to 100% clean energy by 2045, and that'll happen in stages. What this does is it creates the context for innovators to know that there is a commitment coming from the government, that there will be a market there for these technologies. It also helps to de-risk what's associated with the investors. So as policymakers set these big goals forward, we begin to start to really ramp up our innovation to help us to achieve these goals. I'll also bring in, I think this was talked about in another session, but Gavin Newsom recently issued an executive order that all new gas-powered cars, no new gas-powered cars by 2035. And what happens when policymakers begin to put out these bold ideas? Well, we see that things happen and people follow suit. And so there's a new legislation that's been proposed by the federal government, and it's not approved yet, but they're also working to achieve a similar path towards zero emission vehicles by 2035. And I imagine that other states will also take on some of these initiatives going forward. Cannot talk about clean energy without talking about economic development. I'm on the graph on the left, you'll see in 2006, California launched its cap and trade system as a result of policy. And as we see here, while greenhouse gas emissions have successfully declined, our GDP has increased. You know, not everybody thinks that's the best measure of economic growth, but you can see here that there's not an impact on economy. And I would argue that in reality, it's been spurring some of that innovation and driving our economy forward. And as you can see on the right, we have over 500,000 clean energy jobs throughout the state of California. I see this growing more and more, and we also see this throughout the country as well. And so oftentimes we get a little pushback maybe from various groups that we're going to be losing jobs in fossil fuel industry. However, we know that there's a lot of opportunity in clean energy. Now, thinking about investing in ideas. So what do we do here for that? So California has an established innovation ecosystem rising out of Silicon Valley. We have a good model going forward on how do we support technologies to really get to market. And it hasn't worked as well for clean tech. So there was a start early 2008, 2009. We saw a little crash in the clean tech industry, and it never really quite recovered. And so the California Energy Commission has stepped in to really help technologies advance through that system. And so we strategically invest our funds to really help us to achieve our state's policy goals. We have $133 million invested annually from our electric program investment charge. And that's a surcharge that comes on people's utility bills. And so everybody's putting into the pot for research and development, just a little bit on each person's utility bill. And then we have $24 million that's funded for our natural gas research and development program. And we also have some cap and trade funding that goes to food production investment program. And so we have a lot of food producers here in California, and we're helping them to reduce their greenhouse gas emissions. So I talked a little bit about it with regards to entrepreneurs. So we see a lot of funding early on for applied research. That funding tends to drop off as we move into proof of concept, prototype stage, and so forth. And so what the California Energy Commission has done is stepped in to really fund this valley of death to help clean tech entrepreneurs bridge that path from conception all the way to market. And so in order to support that, we've created an entrepreneurial ecosystem, and we're supporting technologies throughout each stage of the technology development pipeline. New Energy Nexus supports us with our first two. So CalSeed is a small grants program. It's really that early stage idea, and they work with the companies to also help them develop as a company throughout that process. We also have CalTestBed, where we have worked with our universities to open up their laboratories to test the technologies in the labs, so they get funding to do that testing. And we're also helping to bring in our university system and our students to really have this exposure to the clean tech industry. We also have our bridge funding, which is a little bit more, it's quite a bit more funding than CalSeed, and it's coming at the later stage where proof of concept has already happened. We're looking at the lab testing to be completed, and then from there, we're looking to RAMP. So RAMP is our program that helps companies to scale up their manufacturing to help them reach market affordable prices for entering the market. All of this is supported by our innovation clusters. So we have clusters throughout the state that help these companies move forward. And we also have our Empower Innovation platform, which I'll talk about in just a minute. So moving into resource networks. So the state of California is not homogenous. There's a lot of diversity. There's a lot of economic diversity, and there's also a lot of diverse exposures to pollution and environmental concerns. And so what we've done is we've committed to helping to advance clean energy for all. And part of that is through our AB 523. It's also a mandate that our program invests 25% of their technology demonstration funds to disadvantaged communities. And that means communities that have been disproportionately burdened by pollution. That's oftentimes people that don't have the economic resources to live elsewhere, and it's really an environmental justice issue. And so this is to help alleviate some of those past environmental injustices and bring new technologies to these communities. We also give 10% to low-income communities as well to help them with their clean energy goals. An example of a project where we're bringing together the innovation that's emerged out of our department and division is our advanced energy communities. These are our first design build challenge, where projects came from communities. We worked very closely with each of the communities to kind of design something that would be relevant to them. And this is an example. This is the Oakland Eco Block. And the idea about the Oakland Eco Block is that they're creating a community that has renewable energy, that has water efficiency, is prepared for droughts, and they're also bringing in a microgrid. And so those are all driven by policy. In order for us to achieve those types of projects and to really work towards achieving our goals, we recognize that strategic partnerships are a critical aspect of that work. And so this is part of the resource network where we're bringing together innovators, local communities, funding providers, and so forth. And we've created an online platform for people to connect around funding opportunities. So I definitely encourage everyone to check that out. And our projects are only as successful as those that are involved. And so we've really found a lot of success when we're connecting with the communities, the community-based organizations, the local governments, and the utilities and so forth to help these technologies advance. So just in conclusion, our thriving ecosystem is really supported by policy that has big goals, invests in ideas, and cultivates resource networks. Thank you.
Great. Thanks, Katrina. That was great. Next up, we have Mona Lisa de Malanta. Mona is chairperson of the Philippine National Renewable Energy Board since her appointment by the president in March of 2019. She is also a senior partner in the PJS Law and among the founders of UNAWA Asia, an inclusive RegTech startup formed as a collaboration between the PSJ Law and Talino Venture Labs, SG. Mona is a professor at the Manila Law School and is also a senior fellow at the National University of Singapore. Mona, take it away.
Thanks, Kate. Good evening, everyone in the US, and good morning for those who are in my time zone. I'm joining you from Manila, from the Philippines, and I understand, I think one of our panelists, maybe Nora, is also calling in or dialing in from this part of the world. So it's such an honor to be part of this panel, of this discussion. Very timely, definitely. And I'm happy that that New Energy Nexus has organized this opportunity for us to really connect and collaborate. So let me start off with my presentation, and taking off from where Kate actually presented. I felt actually I was listening to Kate and I was like, okay, that's what I want to be when I grow up, something like that, because she presented a very I would say at least a very dynamic interaction between policy and innovation in the state of California, and where it has where it has led the state so far. So what I wanted to share with you this evening, this morning in my part of the world is where we are in the Philippines. But let me start off with maybe just some maybe philosophical or basic ideas. I love this. I've always loved this phrase or this statement from Kipling and in Mark Twain's story as well, on east is east and west is west and never the twain shall meet. We've heard this often describing things of polar opposites, and maybe to a certain extent, in at least in the Philippine setup, this is still the main thing when we talk about policy and innovation. They're seen as polar opposites, and maybe that to a certain extent it is true, because policy, the at the heart of policy is really reliance of or predictability. Investors want to know the policy so that they can predict what's going to happen, and they lessen the risk. And yet innovation, the DNA of innovation is really change, and fueling that change, fueling that transformation, so to speak. So, and it all, we've seen several times in history when policy and innovation led to that sweet spot where, I guess, the biggest sweet spot we have seen so far is the industrial revolution, where it brought about that. Kate used this phrase as well, and I like it when things somehow align without us speaking about it. That symbiosis between innovation and policy, where that meets, where also used as when the Goldilocks conditions are all present, when innovation, the right policy somehow find that sweet spot, then we see a lot of change. We've seen from the Industrial Revolution a lot of changes that really defined how we lived. It redefined mobility, it redefined work, education, lifestyle, our values, even the way we treat health and overall well-being of humanity. I like to enumerate this because somehow we can relate to this in all our situations today, wherever we are in the world. Because of COVID, we find that our mobility has been redefined. Work, the way we're doing this now, all on an online setting, the way we teach our children, the way our children are learning things, our lifestyle, our values, health, overall well-being. This is also a situation where we find ourselves with this onslaught of changes that we need to make. And then those changes become persistent and prolonged and then protracted, affecting all areas of our lives. And then it becomes established. And what originally started as something, as change that normally we would resist, becomes policy, becomes the state of the world. So our story in the Philippines is not any different. Our story on energy, our energy story is actually built on renewables. When our energy system started, it was really through a mandate to the National Power Corporation in 1936, when it was established to really explore hydropower resources in the Philippines. We are a group of islands, and it makes the most sense to explore the waters around us as the source of power to fuel our economy. So that was back in the 1930s. We were still under the US then. That's why the law that created the National Power Corporation was a Commonwealth Act. And then fast forward to 1971, when that mandate of the National Power Corporation was expanded to explore geothermal resources in the Philippines. Again, makes the most sense. We're in the Pacific Rim of Fire. We have abundant sources of geothermal power. So that source of power, hydro, was complemented by geothermal. Again, both renewable energy sources. It was expanded to include participation of private sector in 1978. And then we fast forward even further to the 1990s, when the Department of Energy was formed, and they were given that mandate to explore with preferential bias for renewable energy resources. Private sector was already coming into the picture at that time, but only as far as government programs allow them to. For example, partnering with government agencies like the National Power Corporation. Things really took a radical turn in 2001 when the law was passed reorganizing, deregulating the power industry. That was when private sector actually really ramped up its participation in the power sector in the Philippines. So if you think about it, how many decades had passed? About almost 7 decades passed. That it's really purely government driven. The efforts to build the power sector has really been government driven. In 2008, we sort of organized, made a comprehensive framework for the renewable energy development in the Philippines. That was when we have the Renewable Energy Act in the Philippines. Let me point out, so why do I have this point in the history, in the timeline, in my slide? Because this law, the build, operate, and transfer law, is actually our PPP framework, a public private sector participation framework in the Philippines. This is the law that actually ushered in the greatest number of fuel fossil fuel based power plants in the Philippines. This is where this is the basis for most of the coal plants in the Philippines, and they contracted with the National Power Corporation, selling power to the National Power Corporation, and then the National Power Corporation was on selling that power to consumers, to industries, and all that. So this is mainly our story. You'll see that it's predominantly, at least in my slide, because that's the picture I want to show, it's predominantly renewable energy. And private sector only came in the 1990s, and then fueled in early 2000. So where has this led us? This shift or this dynamics between policy and innovation actually has been, what we can take away from this is that mainly, for the most part, it's government driven policy and innovation. So government setting the policy and then moving forward with innovation, at least our version of innovation, setting out those projects that they have identified in their policy making. It was only late in this history that private sector funding and private sector initiatives were part of that, became part of that dynamics. So where does this lead us? This is a snapshot of where we are in terms of the power generation supply in the Philippines. If you recall, in my earlier slide, our Renewable Energy Act was passed in 2008. At that time, we already had almost 34% RE power share in the Philippines, with coal at 25 or 26%. This 26%, if you recall, started around the 1990s when private sector was allowed to come in, and most of the investments from the private sector really went into the coal plants. In terms of our self-sufficiency index, our energy self-sufficiency index, we were already at a pretty decent number at 67%. 10 years down the line, we are, as of last year, as of December of last year, we are at 46.85%. This number is actually continues to go down, and as well as the share of renewable energy continues to go down in our power system. So what happened? What happened in that duration of 10 years? Why, when we finally put together in one framework our renewable energy initiatives, our renewable energy vision, why did it suddenly sort of led us to an opposite direction, or led us to an opposite end? The challenges in the Philippines actually can be summarized into: we need power to fuel a developing economy. We are still a developing economy. And based on the Department of Energy projections, this was pre-COVID, they're still revising the projections as of this date. The Philippines needs around 43 2,765 megawatts of power by 2040, fueled mainly by baseload plants. This was pre-COVID. The situation is actually different as of 2 days ago, and the Department of Energy has actually announced that they are putting a moratorium on development of new coal plants because based on latest assessments of the power requirements, the Philippine system does not need new baseload plants in the next maybe 5 years. But pre-COVID, this was the projection. Another challenge for us, and this is a visual so that you can at least appreciate the nature of our geography in the Philippines. We are a group of islands, as I mentioned earlier, and one continuing challenge is that of household electrification. The numbers look high in Luzon, the two main islands, Luzon and Visayas. The other main island in Mindanao, where the numbers can really be quite challenging, be quite disheartening sometimes because it's actually even lower than this when we think about it today. Because when we talk about the 1.6 million households in the Philippines that remain unserved out of the total population, you translate that to the number of children that are not able to study because they don't have electricity and everything is now online. They don't even have access to the internet. They don't even have lights in their homes. So that's the magnitude of the challenge. So while the numbers look decent in a national level, 92.96 households are electrified, we still need to make sure that no one gets left behind, that this is going to be an inclusive exercise for everyone. What is then the promise of policy and innovation for given the challenges that we face? We have in the Philippines right now the National Renewable Energy Plan. We are proposing, the National Renewable Energy Board, which I chair, we are proposing to the Department of Energy a National Renewable Energy Plan that will cover the next 2 decades, 2020 to 2040. We currently have an existing plan that was developed back in 2009 when the Renewable Energy Act was first passed. It has not been revisited since then. And I think, as we all know, the world has changed since 2009, considerably, primarily driven by technology, primarily driven by innovation. So the what we are proposing to the Department of Energy, and they are very open to this, so we are just formalizing this with them now, is to integrate the innovation that has happened, particularly in terms of the advancement in technology in renewable energy, that it is now no longer the costly, most expensive, or more expensive technology there is. And for a developing economy like ours, cost is always the primary, I think, the primary consideration whenever we adopt policy. How much will this lead to additional pesos in our currency, additional pesos that the normal household would pay? That's always the driver, and that has always been, I guess, the primary roadblock for pushing for more renewable energy resources, because the technology for most RE, at least 10 years ago, 12, 15 years ago, is considered as more expensive. And they were more expensive at the time. But the price of solar, the price of wind, at least onshore wind, has gone down considerably. And these now become more viable for us, especially considering that we are a group of islands. It makes more sense to have generation be hosted by the island instead of building more and more utility scale plants. Also, last year, oh, this is a typo. This should be uh, 2019. So the DOST, the Department of Science and Technology, has actually an innovation council. This is the council that develops, that thrives, that builds or incubates innovation ideas in the Philippines. And they were strengthened last year when the Philippine Innovation Act was passed. So this is hosted at the Department of Science and Technology. It's not one other challenge or roadblock, I would say, in the Philippines, is that the catalyst for change is housed in one other agency, whereas the mandate for innovation, for access to energy, and all things related to energy is housed in a different agency. At the National Renewable Energy Board, we are, I guess, fortunate on one hand, and also challenged by the fact that we have a board that has all these agencies in them, that has representation from all these agencies. So what we are doing at the National Renewable Energy Board is making sure that all the agencies are talking, that they are discussing and finding that synergy, that synergy that will allow for new policies to emerge, and policies that will give that or fuel that environment of change, fuel that environment of innovation. And I think there are signs there are positive signs. The Philippines has actually improved in its global innovation index ranking as of I think this was released just last month, where we have actually improved in our ranking, and we see that. And I give credit where credit is due. We have a very active Department of Science and Technology and a very receptive Department of Energy at this time. So there's a good at least a good, very positive environment for change in these two agencies. Okay, let me just close with this clip that I really like from Sir David Attenborough when there's this video clip. I'm sure you'll find it in YouTube. But the last few seconds of this clip is one thing that really fuels me when I get discouraged, also by when I get daunted by the challenges ahead of us, and where we will find solutions in the face of all these challenges. So let me just end this, and I look forward to a good discussion this evening and this morning from my end.
Species that has been remotely clever and genius than Homo sapiens. Let us live up to that name. We need wisdom to actually find the solution, and then courage to back it.
Okay, so I hope we find the wisdom and the courageous women in this panel today as we continue to discuss. Thank you.
Thank you, Mona. Oh, that was great. And our last panel is Nora Brown from Vietnam. Nora has been working in the field of international development for 15 years, focusing on innovation, entrepreneurship, and investment to achieve development outcomes. Nora currently serves as Chief of Party to USAID Vietnam Urban Energy Security, which is focused on deploying advanced and distributed energy solutions in urban settings through technical and investment mobilization. Prior to this role, Nora was Strategic Investment Advisor with USAID Invest, the flagship initiative of USAID to align the resources and capital of donors, investors, and corporates to achieve the Sustainable Development Goals. Nora previously served as Chief of Party for the USAID Center for Development Innovation project within the U.S. Global Development Lab, supporting the agency's work in open innovation programs. Take it away, Nora.
Great, thank you, and good morning or good evening, everybody. As Mona Lisa said and Kate mentioned, I'm in Vietnam, so I am joining you this morning, and very excited to be here. Let me just share my screen. All right, hopefully that is up now. Great. So I work on the USAID Vietnam Urban Energy Security, and we are focused on advanced distributed energy here in Vietnam. And certainly the policy context plays an important role, one, in our reason for being, and two, in our ability to actually get our work done. So just a little bit of background on the Vietnam energy landscape, maybe somewhat similar to what we heard in our neighbor in the Philippines, but a bit different in our trajectory. There's been about a 10% annual growth in electricity and power consumption here in Vietnam, and that's going to continue. This economy is growing quite quickly, and the need to fuel that is ever increasing. But there are quite a number of resource constraints, and there's some energy security issues in terms of the domestic energy supply. And so certainly there's a great need for expanding and diversifying that energy supply and finding more secure ways to meet that growing demand. We find that there's a limited access to financing, which we'll talk about throughout this presentation. Certainly there's not enough financing here domestically, and there's some challenges in getting an international investment. And we also face some challenges here in the subsidies. The current tariff level for electricity is not quite sufficient to cover all of the costs of servicing those energy needs. So as some of my colleagues have shared before, big goals are important. And so putting, the government has laid out a strategy and a number of objectives to help the country adopt more renewable and more sustainable sources of energy. There's a recognition that we need about 130 gigawatts of power by 2030. And they'd like to see 15 to 20% of that coming from renewable energy sources. There's also a goal of about 7% of energy saved. So energy efficiency is a big piece of that. And I think that often gets lost as we talk about sort of new technologies and generating energy. We also need to be thoughtful about how are we being more efficient with the energy we use. And a hope of 15% reduction in greenhouse gas emissions. So certainly that's going to require quite a bit of investment. And so, with the 130 gigawatts of demand that they're looking at, that's about $150 billion US in investment that's required. And just looking at the energy efficiency, that's about a 1.5 to 3 million or 3 billion investment, and about 24 billion is going to be needed for the renewable energy. So if you think about that $150 billion price tag that's needed, vis-a-vis the GDP of Vietnam in 2019 was 262 billion. There certainly isn't enough investment here internally to be able to support that. Additionally, we definitely need to incentivize innovation. It's not just about getting all the resources in to buy the existing technology, but to think about how are we doing it more effectively, efficiently, what's appropriate for this market, how do we spur that innovation, how do we make space for failure and trial so that we can move forward with new solutions. So in that context, that's where the USAID Vietnam Urban Energy Security comes in. And it's a US government funded initiative that kicked off last year. We've got just 4 short years to achieve some really big goals, which are 400 megawatts of clean energy deployed, $600 million of investment mobilized, and that's domestically or internationally, public and private, and 20 innovative solutions supported. So these are certainly very ambitious goals. These are the numbers that keep me up at night, but there's a huge amount of potential here in Vietnam, and so we're very excited about this. Just some quick background on the project. We've got 3 components to it to strengthen the local enabling environment. So we work very closely with government here to think about what kinds of policies are needed, but then how do you take that policy environment and really make it work for you? Unlocking capital is a huge piece of the work that we do. And then, certainly spurring innovation and thinking about how can we unlock some of the great ideas that are within this country. So all of that is being done within this policy context. And, I think it's important, we've heard a lot about from the other presenters on how policy can spur innovation, but also as Mona Lisa was talking about, it can also sometimes not quite lead to the results that we're looking for. And I think Vietnam is in a situation right now where it's still quite nascent in some of its renewable energy policy. And it's starting to find out some of the unintended consequences, as well as some of the positive surprises. So solar's really gained prominence in policy just in the last few years. In April of 2017, that was one of the big decisions came out that introduced the feed-in tariff. And that allowed for grid-connected projects to know what to expect in terms of what the price was for selling back into the grid. There had been a number of other policies in the last couple of years, sort of in addition to that, but really that was the main policy that was sort of spurred that growth. That ended in the end of June of 2019. And there was a bit of a delay, but April of this year, we got a new decision coming out that introduced a FIT 2 to set the next feed-in tariff regime. And so these feed-in tariffs have been very important in spurring innovation and really the boom of solar here. But they don't come without their challenges. As I mentioned, that first feed-in tariff was in effect between April and June of 2019. It named EVN, which is the local national utility, as the sole off-taker of that electricity. And so in terms of thinking about innovative business models and financing schemes, having only one purchaser really limits your options there. And while it set out these lofty goals and gave some framework to it, there's still a lot of details that were missing and some guidelines around connecting to the grid and some challenges there. And certainly that delay between the end of that first feed-in tariff and the next feed-in tariff was difficult. It gave a lot of uncertainty to investors and developers. The next feed-in tariff did learn a little bit from its predecessor and allows for non-EVN buyers. And so that means if you can put up rooftop solar, you can sell the electricity generated directly to a user. That sort of cuts out the middleman. You don't have to worry about grid connection. But there's still some challenges with this feed-in tariff, which we'll get to in a minute. However, I do want to just point out, it is still a short time frame that we're looking at, but maybe a little bit of a rosier picture than some of the stuff that we saw initially in the Philippines. Although they're so in 2018, at the end of 2018, you can see there was just 18 megawatts of rooftop solar in the entire country. And as of May this year, we're up at 652, and I can say that number is continuing to rise. There's a huge boom in rooftop solar, and that's predominantly one of the technologies that we're focused on in my initiative, just looking at that advanced distributed energy solutions in cities. And so it's in the industrial sector, it's in the commercial sector, and in the residential sector. For us, the south of Vietnam is really the most efficient and effective when it comes to solar, but we do see it popping up in the north as well. However, with all good policies come new challenges. And so certainly I think as these big goals are announced and policies are put in place, we learn a lot about some of these challenges or consequences that we didn't think about in the policy making that maybe come out in the practice. So in Vietnam, there's definitely limited room for negotiation. The power purchase agreement is set. It's a standard template when you are selling to EVN. And the risk allocation that's allowed in that PPA is not really up to international standards. And so that definitely has an impact in investment. There's no compensation for electricity that EVN is able to offtake, which again, just transfers all of that risk to the generator. There's onshore dispute resolution. Again, that's something that is not as big a deal for domestic investors, but for international investors, that is something that is not up to international standard. Lack of payment guarantee, the government isn't going to take on that responsibility. There's no termination compensation and no provisions for changes. So, I think what we're seeing is that these policies are coming out and we're starting to understand what some of these difficulties are. And our hope is that we can start to advocate from the private sector, from the developer side, how this is actually impacting their ability to help the government achieve their goals. We recently did a study here in Vietnam on the barriers and the opportunities in investment. And maybe not surprisingly, policy advocacy was the #1 service requested by developers in terms of what kinds of transaction advisory would be useful. Really being able to have an impact on what the next policies are that are coming out, and helping policymakers understand what their decisions really look like in practice. There's also a number of investment challenges, and I know, I think we all probably recognize this, but just to be quite explicit, innovation really does require investment, as we all know. And so these investment challenges are really preventing some of these creative, innovative entities and organizations from taking off. Some of these policy barriers I've already mentioned, but the commissioning risk, these short timeframes of the feed-in tariffs don't give a lot of time for new projects to come online, get their investment lined up, and actually get completed by the time the feed-in tariff requires. So there's a lot of uncertainty what comes next. Dispute resolution, I mentioned, is under Vietnamese law. And there's no clarity on this long-term planning. There's also a number of capacity challenges that we see here. Project finance is very limited here in Vietnam, and we see low project finance literacy on the developer side, which really prevents them from optimizing their project structure. It's also, there's a lot of, or lack of project finance literacy on the financial institution side as well. And an inability to approach capital providers. There's a real need for building increased linkages and bridges between capital seekers and capital providers here. We've looked at a number of mitigating strategies, and this is really what's driving our initiative in thinking about what kind of interventions can we bring forward, what kinds of activities can we design to help overcome some of these barriers and unlock some of this capital to spur this innovation. From the developer side, there's a high transaction cost, the lack of relationships that I mentioned, the project finance literacy, really coming in and doing some investor facilitation, some transaction advisory work, investor outreach, investor roadshows, building those bridges, building those connections between the capital seekers and the capital providers is really needed. Support in project structuring and building a pipeline. From the investors and the lenders perspective, there is a lot of, this is a very new field in Vietnam, and so there's still a lot of uncertainty about the technology. There's not a high ability for the financial institutions to assess the risk and to think about sort of what the viability of potential projects is. There's high transaction costs, there's high perceived risk when you're not able to really do that due diligence and that risk assessment. And without that project financing, there's a high collateral requirement. And so we've looked at a number of different interventions, including guarantee instruments, putting in first loss investments to lower that risk, awarding grants alongside investment to help reduce that collateral. And that general transaction advisory support, that matchmaking is going to be really important to sort of build out those pipelines. But certainly policy advisory and policy dialogues is going to be a big piece. I think increasing that communication between the policymakers and the policy users is really critical in order for Vietnam to continue to learn from the policies it's putting in place and how it can improve them in order to reach these lofty goals. From the end user side, there's similar issues in terms of accessing finance. Rooftop solar is the costs are definitely coming down, but it's still unreachable for a number of households, and so financing is required. Those high collateral requirements, that riskiness that's perceived. So providing that transaction advisory support, putting in place those guarantees is going to be important to sort of help open this market. So just a couple of case studies to see what that looks like in practice. We're working, for example, with a public hospital in Ho Chi Minh City, and a public hospital is filled with brilliant doctors that don't know a whole lot about renewable energy. So we've worked with them to do a site survey to help them think about sort of the technical and the financial possibilities and opportunities for them to put in solar. And to give them a plan that they can move forward in terms of financing, what kind of technical specifications make sense for their roof, and to support them along the way. We've also been working with an international impact investor that's interested in providing funding to a startup in electric vehicles here in Vietnam. This is also a very new market here in Vietnam. And so there's a lot of uncertainty around the business model assumptions that are being made, and the manufacturing processes and costs here. So being able to provide some of that market assessment, really that due diligence that is going to give their investment committee a bit better understanding about whether or not this is an investment that they're willing to take on and what that promise looks like. So as I mentioned, we're just 1 year into this project. So I anticipate having many more case studies and finding new ways to be able to support Vietnam in reaching these goals, both from a policy standpoint, but also from that application of policy in the cities. So thank you. It's been a pleasure to share a little bit about Vietnam with you all this morning.
Thank you, Nora, and thanks to everyone. So I'd love to move into a conversation now and include the audience as well. So if folks in the audience have questions, please put them in the chat so that we can turn to them. But I'll just start out by saying that looking at the intersection of policy and energy innovation in different places around the world is really fascinating. You've all talked about ways in which policy has been used to help drive innovation, but the conditions on the ground are just very different. Katrina, I heard you say that in California, government is actively investing funds in the private sector and in innovation to achieve state goals. And it's kind of a plant 1,000 seeds approach where the ecosystem is then built to support the strong ones that grow, stepping in where there's more risk and there are fewer private investment dollars. And Mona and Nora in the Philippines and in Vietnam, you guys talked more about very different dynamics on the ground, where government has been more directly involved in the energy sector historically, and is now navigating its way to figure out how to best support that kind of public investment and innovation at a time where both countries' economies are growing quickly, energy demand is growing quickly, and trying to figure out how renewables become more a part of that mix in a very fast-moving environment. So I'd love to just step back and talk about how you think we can accelerate the most impactful strategies you're seeing and drive out the inefficiencies. So, given where you each are sitting, what should policymakers do more of? What strategies, if you kind of had to put your money on something, put your time on something, what would you advise policymakers to prioritize above all else?
I can kick it off. So I'll just talk about what I've seen that works really well for us, and I'm kind of thinking about what challenges we've also faced. So thinking about creating solutions that are really unique to each community. So throughout the state of California, we have very diverse ecosystems. We have mountain ranges with forests, and we have risks to wildfire. We have agricultural areas that are prone to air pollution. And so they're all challenged with very different issues. And so one of the things that I've discovered just in working to help these communities kind of transition to clean energy is really looking to what are the challenges that they have that are related somewhat to clean energy, but that could be also solved with some of the technologies that we bring in and we introduce. So for example, bringing in microgrids to tribal lands where there's a very forested environment and they have a huge risk of wildfire, but it also is not efficient to necessarily bring in those large transmission lines. So all of a sudden you have a distributed energy resource that really serves that community appropriately. And so I think that that's one of the challenges that we have, is that diversity of issues that each community is contending with, but also opens up to kind of this opportunity of creating these diverse solutions that also bring in opportunities for jobs, for small companies to do these tailored solutions for communities, and also kind of spreading the wealth, if you say. So I think it's really interesting. It's a really interesting development opportunity when we start to really look to place-based solutions. And so setting those high goals has been really, really good and really helpful in California. And I will say that they don't set those goals in a vacuum. They know that the technologies are there. And so looking to the technologies that exist to really help you support and drive impactful policies, I think is important. So having policymakers that are aware of the innovations that are available.
Yeah, maybe I'll just follow that up. I think that's a really great point, Katrina, on sort of the diversity and that's needed. And I think, you know, if I think about the policies that we're seeing in Vietnam, not only did they set out large goals, sort of the where we want to go, but they've also given a lot of guidelines on how we're going to get there, which I think, given sort of the early stage that we're in, might make sense. But I think we, from a policy perspective, need to move back a little bit from telling us how we're going to get there and just talking about where we want to end up, to allow more innovation, more opportunity to figure out different ways to achieve those goals, rather than sort of dictating that path from the beginning, and then not allowing some of that creativity to come in. One other sort of point, I think, in it that's particular here, again, given that this is sort of an early stage, but I think goes, probably in California and Philippines as well, is really about the education and the communications around all of this. I think to be able to engage sort of a broad population around why this is so important, how they can play a role in this, and what this means to them, I think is going to be really important. And that's something that we see here, that there's not always a great deal of understanding about why renewable energy is important. It may just be sort of to cut your electricity bill, but without an understanding that it's tied to the air pollution that we see. And so that just continuing to provide better consumer education to bring more and more people into the set of solutions that we're looking for is important. And then obviously, I think that providing a bit more long-term certainty. I know it's always a balance in terms of setting policies that lock us in for too long that might prove to not be the best policies. But without that certainty, I think it's really difficult to move within those environments.
Thank you. Maybe taking off from just what Nora had said, actually, on policy that locks us in, I think that's partly the explanation for what I showed you earlier in terms of the decline, the counterintuitive effect of having set our renewable energy goals in 2008 and leading us to the opposite direction 10 years down the road. Because at that time, if you recall, back in 2008, 2009, the costs of solar and wind were still extremely high. So our feed-in tariff, and we have a feed-in tariff program in the Philippines, the FITs were set at a really high rate. And as costs of solar and wind continue to decline, in dramatic fashion over the succeeding 10 years, there was some sort of an adverse effect in terms of the public perception on renewables. Renewables is high. Look at this feed-in tariff that's set for 20 years, but we're paying for it at that level, when we know that solar has come down maybe 80% from the cost that they were set back in 2010, I think 2012, when we set the tariff. So that's one of those I think one of those traps that we need to avoid, and I that's why I start off with that, with what Nora said. And I think those I don't know if it's unique to us in the Philippines, that it's the nightmare that stays with us rather than the beautiful dream of seeing, of going back. In fact, for me, and I always say this when I'm invited to fora like this, for the Philippines, we talk about energy transition in greater part of the world, but for the Philippines, I think for us, it's really going back to our roots. We started out with renewables we still have a lot of resources that have not been developed for renewables. I think the approach for policy on the question what would we hope our policymakers do, it's really to focus on what we have on renewables and the resources that we have. How do we unlock markets so that markets can develop, can step in, private sector can step in and develop renewables? For a greater part of the history that I shared with you in the Philippines, it's really government driven. So government being, a national, and we are a national, we have our Department of Energy as a national agency. They need to think big. They need to think general application and all that. But now, taking off from what Kate said on finding diverse solutions, big solutions do not necessarily work for a group of islands, because each island would have their own unique problems, unique solutions as well. And maybe what policy can do, and this is one thing that we're also driving at the National Renewable Energy Board, is especially for the unelectrified areas, or what we call our off-grid areas. Maybe we need to find tailor-fit solutions for each area. It's not a one-size-fits-all for all the areas, because they have different circumstances. And this is, again, one of the reasons for the decline. And the approach cannot be purely on providing energy resources alone. It has to be a community development approach. We provide energy that will boost economic activity in the island, so that they get to develop a sustainable way of living as well. So it cannot be just, okay, we provide the solar panels for the community building, and then leave them to fend for themselves. Part of the effort needs to be, how do we develop livelihood that will sustain this source of power for the community, and also maybe but eventually grow the community, educate the children, as what Nora had said, because education is really important. It's as I mentioned earlier, for our what we call the unelectrified areas, the children, if they are able to study at this time, the teachers have to go to the islands by boat, go up the mountains for hours in a day, just to give them their learning packets. And they can only learn when there's light, when there's sunlight, and learning stops when night sets in. So this is not the kind of environment that we expect to nurture innovation, nurture risk taking, nurture change. We need to really get down to the grassroots, and maybe the policy is not to drive in a heavy-handed fashion what needs to be done, but the policy we need, at least for the Philippines, is something that will allow for innovation, more for unlocking change, and allowing for private sector, because the policy is really not for public funds to be spent for power projects, for example. That ship has sailed back in 2000 for the Philippines. Government is no longer funding power generation projects. So we need an environment that will allow private sector money to come in, and all these innovation also to be adopted. At least that's for the Philippines.
I'm curious to hear, Katrina, you talked a bit about the importance of resiliency, obviously with the fires, that's top of mind in California. Nora, I heard you talk about pollution, and Mona, you just spoke about the need for the energy to be there to support economic development and to address the individual needs of different places. None of you talked about climate change as a driver in terms of motivation. And so I'm curious to just hear what you think. Of course, many things motivate policy, but what you think are the real levers, like what's really pushing energy innovation where you are.
I'll just say really quickly, because to me, the wildfires is climate change. So that is really, I mean, at top of mind for Californians. So every fall for the last 5 or 6 years, we have been inundated by air pollution, abundant amounts of air pollution. We cannot go outside. It's dark outside in the peak sunlight because of clouds of smoke. So when I mention wildfire, for us, we know that that's a result of our changing climate. It is a result of drought conditions, of unhealthy trees, and it is an awakening, I think, for many folks to just know that it's here with us now, and it's impacting us greatly. And not only that, but we have COVID on top of it, right? So people are concerned about, the health of our lungs and whatnot. So Gavin Newsom's executive order for the clean transportation was a direct result of what he saw from the wildfires, the dramatic effects of the wildfires here in California. And I say that that has provided a unique context for us to take bold action in California. And so yes, I think, and what's happening here also when we think about resiliency, the wildfires is part of that. So being able to provide power to folks, we're having power safety shutoffs throughout the state of California. So so it's interesting because we're not in a developing country where it's very often you lose power. I mean, that's just a standard part of life. In California, I worked for our major utility, and having days off without power is not a thing. You cannot allow, you cannot lose power to the folks in California, and now they're turning it off for safety. So I think there's been a huge change there with that. So it is driving policy, but they can't make those bold policy decisions again without the innovators there with the solutions to be able to provide the energy storage necessary for the electric vehicles, to provide the infrastructure for charging that will not take down our existing energy infrastructure. But yes, I thank you for bringing that to the top of mind. I think impacts are definitely a big part of what's happening right now in California to really catalyze some of these big policy decisions.
Yeah, I'll say in Vietnam, I think, the motivation has been, I think, primarily economic to begin with, in terms of as I mentioned, it's the GDP and the economy is growing at a very high rate, and energy consumption is skyrocketing along with that. And the security of that energy is in question. And so being able to find new, more secure domestic sources of energy is critical from an economic standpoint and a national security standpoint. I think, and Mona Lisa probably understands this as well. Vietnam has been hit by a number of typhoons lately, and huge storms in the last few weeks. And there've been a number of landslides and flooding, and it's been incredibly tragic to see the loss of life in central Vietnam. And a number of the landslides that happened were caused by a lot of the deforestation around some of the hydropower plants, actually. But beginning to understand some of the effects of climate change on, Vietnam is a really long, skinny country. It's all coastline. And there's huge impacts in terms of what's happening with climate change and how that's affecting its people. And so, but what's interesting is that it's not really part of the conversation, at least from what I hear. It's very much economic driven, national security driven. But I think from the consumer education standpoint, there's a lot more that needs to be done to help link these goals around renewable energy and energy efficiency to climate change, to the air pollution. So Katrina, we feel your pain in California. It's a fact of life over here. Air pollution, Hanoi is one of the dirtiest cities on the planet. And there are many days where you can't go outside. So that's a big issue. And I think from an international donor standpoint, that's a huge driver. But I would say from a national policy standpoint, the economic growth and the national security is really what the driver is. And I think the environmental impact is a bit of an added bonus.
Same here, I think. Same situation in the Philippines. as with Vietnam, it's really the economic reasons that's fueling this discussion. Climate change is real. We are, in fact, in the Philippines, among the top vulnerable countries to climate change. But the perception is that, especially among established or among the, I wouldn't want to say older, but the generation that's ahead, the perception is that we are in the receiving end of all these adverse impacts, but we do not, it's not proportionate to our contribution to the costs. So, and when we start, and trust me, I did try to take climate change or put climate change in the narrative of this discussion in the Philippines. And it's quite challenging. What I realized earlier on when I was appointed at the Renewable Energy Board is that if I start off the discussion or the narrative with climate change, people will immediately close off and not pursue, not even be open to pursuing the discussion, because the issue has always been cost in the Philippines. We still have among the highest electricity rates in Asia, I think second only to Japan, if I'm not mistaken, but we're right up there in terms of electricity costs. And talking about climate change, and of course people feel it. We are bracing ourselves, in fact, to a typhoon again this weekend. It's supposed to be category 4 or 5, this strong typhoon that's coming, and that's now, as Nora had said, a fact of life in the Philippines. Again, as I mentioned, we're a group of islands. We have fishing communities that are that know, eat it for breakfast, know for a fact that that when the waves come in, they are vulnerable, and sometimes there's nowhere else to go, nowhere else to hide. Even if you prepare for it, you just have to accept that livelihood will be lost, and just protect people so that no lives will be lost. But they just assume livelihood will be lost, and it's quite sad. It's quite sad that we've come to that I guess level of thinking, that we just accept it. So the challenge is, and the invitation really is now, to make that case that renewable energy will not lead to higher electricity prices. And that has always been the challenge. But it's good that we are now at that point in time where we can really fight or have a fighting chance when the discussion comes down to cost, because there used to be no fighting chance for renewable energy. You talk about lofty ideals, or people would think, okay, we'll think about climate change later. We need to think about what we will eat first for lunch and dinner at this time of day. So, but now we can make that case, and we are making that case for the voluntary market that we are launching in the Philippines, where we are putting together a program where MSMEs, small, medium scale enterprises, can actually contract directly for renewable energy. So now, because we can make the case that they will lower their electricity bills if they buy directly renewable energy. So now we can make that conversation. We can engage people credibly in that conversation, and that's why we're quite hopeful that we are going towards a more sustainable and energy secure discussion in the Philippines.
Interesting. Is it that the energy community and the energy innovation community are all focused on cost, and there's a separate group of kind of activists concerned about climate change, and the two don't really meet? Or is there not really climate activism?
In the Philippines, I think it's not that there are separate. I think they are. It's definitely one community, or it's the same community, I would think. Those that have individual motivation. I think the motivation to fight climate change is on an individual basis. People are moved. There are individuals like me, and among the youth community, definitely there are motivations for the key motivation, or the trigger, is really climate change. But there's also, I think, a recognition that the issue of cost needs to be addressed, and it needs to be addressed directly if you are going to fight for climate change. So I think there's an integrated approach, at least from the Philippine experience. I don't know in Vietnam if it's the same.
Yeah, I mean, it's a good question, and I think again, I do think that there is at the policymaker level, a good understanding about climate change and the environmental impacts that these energy policies are having. And I do think that that is part of that factors into that decision making. But I will say, just from sort of the optics or the communication is really much more from an economic and a national security standpoint, because I think they've decided that's what resonates with the population. And I do find, just in general conversation with people here, that the link between the kind of electricity you use and the climate change and the air pollution, that's not a very well understood link. And it's not something that's often sort of pointed out from a high level. And so that's where coming back to sort of that consumer education, I think, is really important to motivate people. I think everybody has different motivations. I think economics is going to drive certain people. Sort of national security or patriotism might drive some people, but certainly the environment and the impact that their one small choice of putting up solar on their roof can have an impact on the kinds of air their children are going to breathe, I think motivates other people. And so I really hope that it can be a bigger part of the conversation, because it needs to be better understood here.
So last question.
Hold on.
Go ahead.
I'm just going to bring in one piece from California. This is new. I mean, it's evolved definitely since I've been in the field of energy. And so what motivated us previous was like savings, energy savings, right? And also not needing to bring on new power plants and build new infrastructure. If we can save energy, that's the best approach. And so we had a lot of investment in energy efficiency first to get us going. And then I think as we saw solar drop off, as we invested and kind of took that risk to invest in solar and create kind of a market around it, really solar began to drop off in prices. And we're seeing the same pattern with energy storage. And so the economics are really, luckily, the economics are falling into place. So really happy to hear that. And I think climate change, like you said, I think the youth have a bigger investment in that future. And so they're definitely being raised in that environment. And I think that that's shaping their worldview. So excited to also see that energy from the youth as well. And I'll just say, I think the new issues, the new impacts that we have in California have just created more of that urgency. And I mean, we're still trying to convince our federal government to sometimes acknowledge climate change. And so it is a diverse environment in the US as well. And we're contending with it. So
Great. No, thank you for that. Very important. So my last question is, do you all, given kind of that you're sitting at the nexus of innovation and policy, do you have advice for those of us in the energy innovation community, or those of us as part of New Energy Nexus who are trying to convene that innovation community, advice about how we can help policy makers focus in the right places, or shift if they're not focusing in the right places? Have you seen strategies that work?
A lot of silence. I'll jump in. That's a big question, and it's a difficult one to answer. But certainly, I think continuing to amplify the stories and to communicate sort of what we're seeing and what that impact is. And I think that's amplifying both the successes and the failures that we see. Continuing to help policymakers understand sort of those consequences of their policy choices. And help them make that link to how those policy choices are impacting your ability to do the work that you're trying to do, and how that may or may not be helping reach those lofty goals that are put out there. So I think those policy dialogues are incredibly important, and that communication is important. I think it's in Vietnam. I think this very much holds true, but globally in the innovation work that I've been doing. I think we just need to celebrate that failure a lot more and be okay with it, and understand that that just gives us a better sort of step towards the right thing, that we can learn from that, we can build from that. But making sure that we're building in those opportunities for that feedback to make sure, again, and this goes to this, I think, balance in policy of not locking ourselves into the wrong policy, but also creating an environment that has some certainty around it. And I know it's a very, very delicate balance, but I don't think it's going to be done well unless there's really good open communication between those policymakers and those that are trying to act and apply within that policy environment.
Definitely, I agree with what Nora had said. I think engagement is the key contribution that that groups like New Energy Nexus can offer. Government can sometimes, or policymakers can sometimes get too embedded in routine, or not really routine, but in the way things are done. So disturbing it a little bit somewhere along the way always help wake things up, and shake things up. I think that's good, and that can only be done with continuous engagement. Because if you come in only at in intervals, then the trust is not established, and it's very hard for policymakers to listen to recommendations if it's not coming at a level of it's not coming in with at least a certain minimum level of trust. So that continued engagement is always helpful to build trust, at least in the Philippine context. That's always important. And second is the network. I think it's helpful also for government to see, for policymakers to see what's happening out there and what other countries are trying out. Because one of the reasons, or for the fear of trying out new things, of trying out innovation, is, what if I'm the first mover and I fail? Then I'll face all these even lawsuits for government leaders in the Philippines can be a real thing when they're perceived as having moved first without really testing the waters, or having someone else test the waters. So I think that that network is always helpful to address the hesitation on the part of policymakers in being open to innovation.
Thanks, everyone. I'll share a little bit. We have our EPIC Symposium, and one of the things that we do is we invite our legislatures to speak. So we invite our policymakers to the table, and so that they can also hear about what's happening in our innovation community. The other thing that I think is really important is that we invest in innovation, because what happens when we invest in our innovators is, even if that technology fails or that company fails, we have developed someone that can spin off, that can leap from what they learned from that first adventure, and kind of go in and take those lessons learned and be potentially successful the next time around. So we're really cultivating innovators. And so I think that's really important when we think about how we're going to support us to achieve these goals. I think as we've implemented solar, we've seen, we've had all these challenges that have come about from that. And so we need a lot of different solutions, this energy storage, smart home devices, those types of things to help us to control our homes and help us to make it so that we don't create a burden on our infrastructure. I think it's really unique just to hear Nora and Mona Lisa in the place where they are in the development, and really supporting when Mona Lisa says electrification, she's talking about bringing electricity to homes. In California, when we say electrification, it means getting rid of our fossil fuel burning gas stoves. And so it's a really different context, a really different story. But I think what I love about the innovators that we have, and what the New Energy Nexus funds and supports, is really all of these different solutions that can work together and create robust energy in the places where they're being used. So distributed energy resources we don't need the huge infrastructure investments that we used to have with these huge generating power plants that are, miles and miles away. If we can get really smart about how we plant how we use the renewable energy resources of those communities, the micro hydros, the solar, the geothermals, all of those things, I think it's going to create a much more robust and resilient a clean energy future for all of us. I think all of us are working towards those goals still. California obviously has a different place from where we're coming from, but we're still working with challenges in making this transition. And just really excited to kind of be on the edge of this and be sort of mid-career. I get to see this happen and see all of these wonderful people doing great work. So thanks for having me too.
Great. Well, Katrina, I think we'll leave it there. That was a great summary and such an honor to be on this panel tonight with the three of you. Thank you so much for your time. And I think Neha from New Energy Nexus is going to come on with just some final words.
Yeah, thank you all so much. I learned so much over the past hour and a half. It's really incredible to be able to dive deeply into a lot of these numbers and look at past historical moments that have allowed for innovation to happen, and also see where we're going, and to also notice how this can be unique across different regions. And if we really are going to, I think, enforce the change that we want to see in the world, we're going to what you were just mentioning, really utilize these local approaches, but also ensure that there are levers on a global level and on a political policy level that allow for these things to happen. And I think we're about to witness a lot of change in the next few years. Just the news and the headlines that are coming out left and right. It's an exciting time to be alive and see what will happen. So thank you all for your efforts in all of this. It's really great to know that we have wonderful minds in wonderful and influential places. And we're excited to have this be a really big part of Accelerate Energy series. So this is one of the many conversations that we're having across all different facets of the clean energy ecosystem. Earlier this week, we talked about startups in emerging markets that are catalyzing energy access. Today, we talked about the role of policy and innovation. And in the coming weeks, we'll touch on many other topics as well. Oh, it looks like I can't share my screen, but I'll drop in a couple of links so that you can learn a little bit more about Accelerate Energy series and New Energy Nexus. One thing I want to call specific attention to is the Miro board. So we're going to be artifacting information from each session so that you can both check out the YouTube video in case you want to revisit some of the slides, but also see what's happening in the other sessions. And it looks like I can share now. So just to give you a glimpse of the upcoming topics, we're going to talk about climate fintech. We're going to talk about engaging family offices, best practices for incorporating an equity lens into entrepreneur support programs, and then really bringing it all together. What are the best practices for accelerating clean energy ventures, given all of the discussions that we have over the coming few weeks. So with that, I will turn it over to, I guess, the rest of your evenings or mornings or afternoons, wherever you might be dialing in from. Thank you again to Katrina, Mona, Nora, and Kate for the wonderful discussion. I know I will certainly be going back into the live stream and revisiting a lot of those numbers, not only because I want to digest them, but because it also gives me a lot of hope for what is possible in the coming months, years, and decades. So thank you all so much. And feel free to chime in, Kate or Olivia, if I'm missing anything, but thank you all so much.
Great, thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thanks, everyone.
Thank you all.